and welcome to this episode of ArtsAbly in Conversation. My name is Diane Collin. I am a woman with short hair, blue eyes, and glasses, and today I wear a black top. Behind me is a dance studio with gray walls, tall mirrors, and spotlights. This series presents artists, academics, and project leaders who dedicate their time and energy to a better accessibility for people with disabilities in the arts. You can find more of these conversations on our website, artsably.com, which is spelled ArtsAbly.com. Today, ArtsAbly is in conversation with Dr. Chi Yhun Lo, who is a research associate in the Smart Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University in Canada. You can find the resources mentioned by Chi Yhun Lo during this episode on ArtsAbly's website in the blog section. Welcome to this new episode of ArtsAbly in Conversation. Welcome, Chi.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for making space in the very busy schedule that you have right now.
So I am a Southeast Asian man. I'm wearing glasses right now, and I've got my headphones with some brightly colored yellow pads. Um, I have a light stubble around my mustache and beard. And the room that I'm in is my office, which has a whiteboard with some writing in the background, and I'm currently wearing a dark blue navy shirt.
Thank you. Okay, so I read all the research that you're doing, and it's amazing.
Thank you.
And I am interested in first exploring before the researcher where all that came from. Who are you? What is your background?
Yeah.
Things like that. When
Yeah.
did the little spark start?
Yeah, I guess it really starts from childhood for me, where I think like in maybe in a lot of Asian households, the children are often encouraged to learn music. So I have two other siblings. I learned piano, my brother learned cello, and my sister learned violin. So we had a nice little trio. And I think that to me was the starting point for music engagement. But I suppose the thing was that I actually don't think I enjoyed music a lot as a child. I think it was all very um, it was a little bit forced, and it was a little bit like rote learning. I didn't really have a real appreciation for it until a little bit later in life, when I think when I was a teenager, and I think I sort of like really got into playing guitar, really got into the Beatles, and I was like, this is music to me. I understand it now. Um, and music became something really incredibly fulfilling. And I think it really formed a massive part of my social identity. Ever since then, I think I haven't really looked back in terms of musical engagement. Um, I subsequently became a audio engineer when I left school, and I used to do a lot of I did a lot of live shows, and I had sort of two sort of streams of types of shows. I would be doing either really big festival type shows during the summer season in Sydney. There would be massive acts. It could be, for example, I did some work with Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys, Silver Apples, um, Nick Cave, Missy Higgins, some big Australian artists. But my main gig as well, I was a touring front of house audio engineer, and I used to do a lot of work for a children's band. It wasn't the Wiggles. It was the Hooly Doolies, the poor man's version of the Wiggles in Australia. Um, and that to me was a really fascinating sort of period of my life, I suppose, where, on one hand, I'm working with adults, and you can see the importance of engagement with music. It's such a critical part, I think, of humanity, But at the same time, when you see the kids interacting, you can quite clearly see it's sort of like, these are kids who have not really been trained in music. These are kids who are 2, 3, 4 years old, and they're engaging with music. They're dancing. There's something incredibly intuitive and almost instinctual when it comes to engagement with music. Um, I then subsequently, I think being an audio engineer is a or a roadie is a tough life. You have to move so much audio equipment, and you're the first one there and you're the last one out. And I remember driving the truck back to the workshop at 4 a.m. and I was thinking, I can't keep doing this. I think I need to find something else. So I decided to go to university. Um, and I completed a bachelor degree in speech and hearing science. It, I don't know how it is here in Canada, but in Australia, you've got a really thick book where it's like all of the courses and all of the universities, and it's actually incredibly challenging to find out what it is you want to do. But I saw, hearing, and I thought, that's something that I'm deeply passionate about. So I jumped into that degree. And I was very, very fortunate to get involved in a undergraduate internship program with Harvey Dillon at the National Acoustic Laboratories in Sydney. And Harvey at the time was the head of the National Acoustic Lab, which is the Australian government research wing that does anything to do with hearing and deafness science. Um, and I got involved in a project that was looking at spatial processing disorder, which is this condition where um, children have a lot of trouble sort of focusing their sound by integrating their ears. And where this becomes really important is in the context of listening in a classroom, for example, where maybe you are with your class and they're all sort of behind you, and your teacher is in front. And if you have spatial processing disorder, it becomes very difficult to maybe separate the sound sources. Like the teacher is here and the classmates are here, but in your mind, everything is sort of just condensed. So it was a project looking at that. Um, and they developed a auditory training program, and my mind was blown because I was like, auditory training? This is a thing? I had like absolutely no conception of this. And so I got involved in a PhD project where I really utilized all of my experiences. I looked at my experience with music and audio engineering and all of that, and then this idea of auditory training. So my PhD started to explore the benefits of music for deaf and hard of hearing children. So that's, I guess, the short journey of how I've come through to that. I'm currently a senior research associate at the Smart Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University. I'm also affiliated with Macquarie University, where I'll be taking up a new postdoctoral position in the new year, investigating neurodivergent auditory processing. I also have an honorary appointment with the Australian Institute of Health Innovation. And finally, the last hat that I'm going to put on is I do work with the parents of deaf children. So I'm currently the secretary, but in the past I've been the vice president. And the Parents of Deaf Children are a non-profit charity organization that supports deaf and hard of hearing families. It's really about providing families with as much sort of, I guess, unbiased and really informed information so that they can articulate and make the best decisions for their family. Um, so I guess that's my basic introduction in a nutshell.
Can you give us a little bit of details on, for example, I know you did a lot of work about cochlear implants. You did research and you did processing and back in Australia, but also what you're doing right now in the lab.
Yes.
So can you explain what you're doing
Yeah.
exactly?
Definitely. So it was a very rich experience in Australia because um, I was based in the Australian Hearing Hub at Macquarie University, and literally next door, about 50 meters away from us, was Cochlear headquarters. So an excellent opportunity to really do some collaboration with Cochlear Limited over there. And I have done some consulting with them on some of their music applications, for example. So a lot of my work coming out of my PhD and sort of continuing since then was really looking at music and deafness. And I think when I talk about music and deafness, I guess the first thing that sort of comes to our mind is, okay, in this sort of contemporary context, it's sort of music and hearing aids, music and cochlear implants. And a lot of people are often like, "Oh, that's it must be such a new topic, such a new experience." But I think what's really fascinating is, and I'm just going to pull up a slide on here because I want to read this section, because it actually comes from the American Annals of the Deaf, and there was an article from 1848. Okay, so this is 250 years ago. This is predating like essentially the fields of like the professionalization of audiology and psychology almost. And the article was Music Among the Deaf by W. Turner. And in this, and I just want to read this quote here. He writes this here. We have often been asked the question by visitors, have the deaf any idea of sound? We have answered, they have no more idea of sound than the blind have of colors, as the idea of sound can be imparted to the mind only through the sense of hearing. Those who are totally deaf must therefore be wholly destitute of any such idea. So these are very, very powerful words. And again, this is coming from the context of 1848. They may know much about sound, may know how it is propagated, its law of transmission may be familiar to them, and still they may and must be entirely ignorant of its nature. Another question is sometimes asked whether the deaf can be taught music. This question, like the first, we have answered in the negative, presuming that hearing is indispensable to its acquisition. But this is the important part right at the end here. A little reflection might have led us to a different conclusion. And fortunately, W. Turner did spend a lot of time reflecting. He was very lucky because he met a young woman who was profoundly deaf. Her name was August Avery, and she had been trained how to play piano. And he was absolutely gobsmacked. He couldn't believe it at first. But when he realized to some extent how wrong his initial conceptualization of what music and deafness sort of that interaction meant, he really turned his idea around. He subsequently became a real champion for deafness and music. And so for me, I think historically and even to this day, there's a real sort of prioritization that music engagement is all about hearing. And to some extent, like this is quite incompatible to I think the general idea of what deafness entails. But for me, there's a lot of things to unpack. Number one, the construction of deafness is across a whole range. We have a whole range of, the using the medical model of deaf diagnoses, right? From sort of mild to complete deafness. There are also sort of assistive listening devices that we can use, hearing aids and cochlear implants. There's also the use of sign language or other alternative or augmented sort of communication methods as well. And I want to bring all of these in because when I think about music, again, it's not just about hearing and that auditory thing. So if I use the example of let's say let's have a violin player, for example. Now we've got our violin player and maybe we set them up and they've got their sheet, their score in front of them. And so we've got the action, right, of playing. We've got motor control here. So we've got this motor system being engaged. We've got the use of the visual system because we're looking at the score. We also clearly have the auditory system, and it's a bit of a feedback loop because we're trying to play something and we want to hear it, and we might make adjustments if we're not playing the right key. But now let's say maybe we remove the sheet music. Now we're leveraging, executive functioning and working memory. Maybe we ask the violinist, please compose us some music. So again, we're leveraging all of this cognition and creativity. Maybe we turn it into an ensemble, and now we've got this group and social dynamic happening. So really, the function of music, yes, audition is a part of it, but it's massive in scope. And I think when we think about it in this multi-sensory perspective, that's a much better way of looking at how music can be universally applied, irrespective of what sort of capacities you might have. And then we can also think about how we can generate benefits through this conceptualization of music. So my work with sort of cochlear implants and hearing aids and deafness in general, it really stemmed from some of my interactions that I had with sort of family members to begin with, where a lot of them would tell me that, number one, in the Australian context, a lot of deaf and hard of hearing kids are mainstream educated. Um, I'm not entirely sure how the context plays out in Canada, but I assume that it's probably similar. These days we have newborn hearing screening, early intervention. So a lot of these children are having very good access to auditory cues, and subsequently, quite sadly to some extent, a lot of sort of specialized deaf schools have been reducing in their numbers. I think there are pros and cons to this. But a lot of the families would often tell me that when it came to something like music engagement, maybe they have a choir, for example, in the school, or they have a little ensemble, or maybe they're all just playing recorder, like a lot of kids. And a lot of parents would often express that the teachers and the staff really didn't think that these deaf and hard of hearing kids would be sort of suitable to sort of join these classes. And so there's a lot of exclusion here. And for me, coming from this perspective of like music fundamentally has been so important for my development. And I think it has a real place to play in really everyone's development. And so for me, that was just this plain discriminatory, you know. And so for me, as a researcher and as an advocate as well, having these two hats, I was like, well, what can I do? So I was like, well, I really want to explore what are the benefits of music participation for deaf and hard of hearing kids. So my PhD explored a 12-week um, music program, and this was primarily music therapy supplemented or complemented by this app that we had. And on the app, it was a range of sort of musical activities. And after this 12-week period, we were interested in a couple of different outcomes. Number one, the biggest challenge for most deaf and hard of hearing kids comes with listening in noisy and complex environments. And that's really where I would argue that's where a lot of social activity happens. If you think about like any social engagement we have, whether it's a restaurant, a pub, a club, even libraries are quite noisy these days, a lot of them. These are places where we have these powerful social interactions. And when we think about it in the context of children, it's happening in the classroom where, again, they engage in a lot of auditory tasks and children are inherently noisy. So really the educational outcomes, that's a big part. But another consideration is what happens in outside the classroom and in the playground. Again, a very noisy place, but that is really where all of that social facilitation happens. And for children, once they've reached the age of about 5, 6 onwards, they start moving away from these dyadic or these sort of one-on-one conversations, and they start moving towards group conversation. So it's really important that we really maximize the opportunity to communicate in these complex and noisy environments where they're going to be learning either their education or they're going to be learning how to socialize and develop a peer support network. And the really nice finding from the PhD was after 12 weeks of music, there were dual benefits. There was a benefit for speech and noise perception. So we found communication benefits. But on the other side of things, we also found psychosocial benefits too. So things such as what we sort of classify as these internalized problems, things like low mood or depression, these were also boosted by music engagement. So for me, it was really sad hearing what had been happening historically, where teachers or the school system might be thinking, these deaf and hard of hearing kids, they can't participate in music. When in fact, my findings were there are some really specific benefits here that are specifically beneficial for deaf and hard of hearing kids. So to deny them this is absolutely terrible. So I've been using a lot of that to try and articulate um, the accessibility of music for deaf and hard of hearing kids. Um, Now, there's this broader political perspective happening in Australia at the moment, where I'm not sure if you're familiar with the National Disability Insurance Agency, the NDIA, or the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So this is a massive political undertaking that happened about 10 years ago. And the Australian federal government provides a significant amount of financial support for a range of disabilities. And essentially, if you have a disability, you can sign up for this program. And depending on what your sort of functional needs are, they provide you with full sort of monetary funding support. Um, for example, if you are a deaf and hard of hearing child, you might require audiological service, you might require speech pathology service, you might require sign language interpretation services, so on, a whole range. But it extends a little bit further than maybe these typical sort of medical sort of perspectives. You can also access things like music therapy or art therapy or creative therapy. Um, until recently, where they're starting to tighten up on their sort of funding model. And sadly, I think the same thing that happens in education, whenever the money is getting a little bit thin, the first thing they always remove is the creative art and music therapy. So this is something that's been happening recently where they're in discussion about removing music therapy as one of their sort of key services that the Australian government will fund and provide. And again, to me, this just goes in the face of everything that I and others have researched, where we found these specific benefits. And to remove that goes against the empirical evidence. So it's something I really want to push back against because I think it's going to set us back considerably. So that is one of the sad things that's currently happening in the Australian landscape.
And with your research, are you able to try to prove that it's going the wrong way and maybe try to have a communication with these services?
Exactly. That's exactly what we've done. So we have already been partnering with the Australian Music Therapy Association. So they are the peak body that represents sort of music therapy in Australia. They are the ones who are most affected at the moment. So we have been writing as many letters of support as we can, and a lot of other even like the field of audiology. There are a lot of people in there who have been able to amplify our voice as well. So we have already had discussions with some of the key politicians. So hopefully, come the new year, they're gonna have a bit of a rethink, because I would love to see music and creative and art therapy still maintained within the National Disability Insurance Scheme.
And this is your the I wouldn't say the study cases because it's not human enough, but the people you work with, it's mostly children, or did you work also with adults?
I've also worked with adults, so that was really the start of my PhD, but I've since sort of expanded. A lot of the work now actually continues through my current PhD student. So I want to have a shout out to my absolutely wonderful PhD candidate, Felicity Blackley. She's a bilateral cochlear implant user. And her PhD is really focused on some much more complex ideas now around music and deafness. Um, Her PhD is really focused on, number one, a specific type of deafness. So Whereas I was looking at things such as congenital or prelingual deafness in the context of children. She's focusing exclusively on postlingual or almost like age-related hearing losses, where we do know as a sort of typical function, our hearing does decline with age. Um, but her real interest, I guess, it comes from her own personal experience, where she has always had a profound connection with music as a musician, like so many musicians do. And she subsequently lost her hearing later in life and now uses two cochlear implants. And she initially found the experience in terms of that sort of that auditory perception and that level of engagement. It just was not, it just wasn't sufficient. It and it's impossible for us to expect any device such as the cochlear implant to sort of replace our sort of hearing ability. It's a completely different way of interpreting sound. We have close to, I think, maybe 20,000 hair cells that do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to auditory perception. And when we look at the cochlear implant, we are down to 20 electrodes, maybe trying to do the job of 20,000 hair cells. So we lose a lot of the acuity. Um, but that area has been investigated quite a lot. We do know that auditorily, a cochlear implant is nowhere near a human ear. But the area that Felicity is really interested in is a lot more nuanced, a lot more psychological, where it's like, okay, well, what is the consequence? You know, how do people engage with music when they have a postlingual deafness? And how does their relationship with music change? So, for example, you know, she often talks about how there is such a massive grieving process for her. Because on one hand, you know, she hasn't just lost some hearing capacity. She's also lost that connection and that engagement with music to some extent. And so a lot of our research is trying to understand, well, how can we get that level of engagement back? How can we maybe reframe music to some extent? Um, so it's really interesting as well, where I think some of the methods that Felicity is using as well. It's not a very traditional scientific study, you know, like where, you know, maybe we have a battery of questionnaires and we bring someone into the lab and we're like, oh, can you tell us what this sounded like and look at the performance, you know, very stereotypical standard psychological experiment. In this case, Felicity's asking for a whole battery of very interesting things where we ask individuals to send us little snippets of music that might have some very personal significance, some meaning. Or we ask them to send in some imagery that also has meaning. And we start doing analyses of this, or a little biographical written two-page piece about their experience as well. And we're sort of triangulating all of this data to have a more holistic perspective of what music might mean. And I think what's really interesting is how, for a lot of these individuals, there is this initial grieving period where there's a massive period of loss where, for a lot of them, and I think I'd be the same as well, you know, music has always been there for me. It doesn't matter, you know, in what sort of emotional state I'm in, if I'm happy, if I'm sad, if I'm high, if I'm low, if I need a boost or if I need something to calm me down, music is always there. But you imagine when you lose that sense that connects you primarily, or the sense that you have always associated through hearing with music, and you lose that, and you are also grappling with your new sense of sound. And now your one source of comfort, music, is also diminished. It's also gone. So it's almost like a double problem, you know? So that's what we are currently exploring, because a lot of the hearing aid manufacturers, a lot of the cochlear implant manufacturers, a lot of the engineers, the focus is primarily on speech perception and communication. And for us, it's sort of like, okay, that's all well and good, but have you also just considered music is going to be really important, not just for, you know, not just for musicians, but really a lot of people. So we really want to look at ways in which we can improve the acuity of these devices on one hand, but we also just want to understand, okay, what's really happening and how can we maybe develop programs in the future that might be able to articulate this a little better, or maybe even just communicate this with audiologists so that they are going to be fundamentally aware of what the needs are.
In France, there is a specific brand called Audica, and this brand developed a few years ago a special program. I think their first study cases were with Radio France, so the French national radio, and then they extended it to anybody, and it's based on um, hearing aids or hearing improvements
Yeah,
for musicians.
yeah,
And they created a full lab with a lot of ways to measure. You have to come with your instrument or to sing if you're a singer, and then they test and they follow the progression. And they have developed a special kinds of hearing aids where it's way more improved than any other hearing aids. You have way more settings, you have way more channels,
yeah.
and you rechecked very frequently. And I followed their study, and it's very, very interesting. I wonder if you had that kind of experience to test with instruments directly with the participants.
Yeah, so well, in Felicity study, that's not the focus, but that was the focus of some of my work previously and some of my other work as well. So we are very interested in, I guess, looking at different types of perceptual judgments. So one of the tasks that we do look at um, in the pediatric study was, how they can identify different instruments. Um, it's also really interesting, I suppose, because a lot of parents often asked me at the end of the study, oh, okay, my child really enjoyed participating in music and we want to continue. What instrument can you recommend? That's probably the most common question I've always been asked. What instrument can I recommend? And for me, there's a couple of ways to answer this. So perceptually, pitch is going to be more challenging than rhythm. So you could argue that going for percussive instruments is like an easier choice if maybe you're looking at getting them into music to begin with. But I don't necessarily think that's the best approach because there are other different types of instruments where even though their pitch perception might not be as good as a typical hearing child, for me that just doesn't matter. I think it's the same concept in I am not going to have as good pitch perception as a professional musician. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to just try playing piano anyway. You know, Piano also has the advantage where you can see all of the keys distinctly and they're labeled and organized in a very sensible way from low to high in pitch. Um, it's similar in a guitar or a stringed instrument, but there's a little bit more complexity as well because you have those multiple strings happening. Um, but my answer for parents was always really quite simple. I was like, there is no such thing as a best instrument for any given child. It's just what's the best instrument for your child is provide a whole suite, a whole array. Don't go and buy the instrument outright, just hire it, or hopefully your school has a range. See what they engage with, because whatever they're going to engage with and continue with, that's the best instrument for them. You know?
Super
So
true.
so 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 for me, irrespective of whatever we have in our research findings, that to me is the perspective I will always take.
Yeah. And did you hear of this study in Melbourne, by the way, speaking of Australia, and with the Melbourne University, and they paired with the conservatory, and they also paired with someone who's an organologist, so someone who studied the instruments themselves, and they have improved, or at least they constantly improve the use of instruments for their musicians with disabilities.
Yeah,
And
cool.
I don't know if they did a study about hearing. That's a question I have
Yeah, I don't,
no.
I'm not so familiar with that. I mean, historically there was some really interesting stuff coming out of Melbourne. They were doing, for example, they got a they wanted to develop some concerts for cochlear implant users, for example. So they did a lot of work with audiologists and individuals with lived experience, and then pairing them with composers, and basically looking at how there is going to be a difference in hearing hearing. So you want to tailor the sound for someone with a cochlear implant. And a lot of work has been done on that actually, where cochlear implant users have a preference for the vocal track. They want the vocal track to be maybe 3 decibels louder, just a little bit louder than a mainstream mix, just to be able to hear the vocals and the lyrics and the melody just a little bit more. So these are some interesting things that are being done. There's also a sort of a deaf musician advocate in Australia called Asphyxia, and they developed a program called Amplio, where it's looking at how some of the song composition and the song mix can be adjusted for a deaf and hard of hearing population. So I think there's a lot of interesting work being done in this space.
I have a question for you as a musician.
Yeah.
All this research, how did it affect your perception of music as a musician?
Oh, I think it made me realize the multisensory nature, number one. Like I think before sort of becoming a researcher, I think I also had that bias where it's like, oh, it's all about my ear, it's all about the hearing. But when I really took a lot of time to reflect on it, it's like, no, there's so much more to it. And I think that sort of perspective, it just broadens the possibility of what music can be and what music can mean. So to me, it's just expanded my scope of, I guess, musical engagement and musical practice. On the other hand, because I'm so busy as a researcher now, I've lost my calluses on my fingers. Like I actually don't have enough time to play. I do a lot more research and a lot more listening to music than I do getting to play music. But to be fair, I guess I think there are I would probably prefer listening to other musicians than listen to myself anyway. So I'm comfortable with that. I think we all have our specialties, and I'm a better researcher than I am a musician.
So, what does it mean for you to work in that kind of research environment where you promote disability culture and you work about accessibility in the arts? What does it mean for you?
For me, it's something that I'm number one, I'm deeply passionate about. Like that's my selfish perspective. I'm doing this because I love it. But I also want my passion and my research interest to be reflected and to have application. That to me is also fundamentally important. I'm not like a theoretical researcher. What I do has to be empirically grounded, and it has to have fundamentally benefit for the community. So that's why it's really important that I do a lot of engagement work with, for example, the parents of deaf children. I like to give a lot of talks and at conferences or workshops where it is really important that I present this work. I want to see music and deafness taken really seriously, and for it to be accessible, and for it to be accessible throughout the world, and from the start through to the finish, from kids all the way to older adults. I think there are benefits throughout all, and a lot of my research really spans that as well. So I've spoken a little bit about the pediatric work, a little bit of work from my PhD candidate, and also some of the work that I'm doing going forward is really centered around now choir singing. So some of my most recent work, we are looking at projects with Singwell. The Singwell project is housed at Toronto Metropolitan University and is co-directed by Professor Frank Russo and Dr. Arla Good. And it's really about generating and examining the benefits of group singing for populations which have some sort of communication disorder. So this can be anything from aphasia, Alzheimer's, and in my case, hearing loss. So I'm leading a multi-site study where we are going to examine 12 weeks of choir singing in older adults. And specifically, these now are older adults with what we sort of classify as unaddressed hearing loss. So these are older adults who typically through aging, their hearing sort of drops off a little bit. And the sensible thing to do for most of these individuals would be see an audiologist and, you know, consider whether or not they're going to get benefit from a hearing aid. Because in most cases they will. But there is a lot of stigma attached to assistive listening devices. And in about 70% of the cases where they would likely benefit from a hearing aid, these adults actually just don't get a hearing aid. Or they might have a hearing aid and it's just in the bedside table. Very, very, very common. And the stigma is incredibly powerful. Um, but it's really interesting because when I've spoken to some of my sort of audiologist colleagues, you know, this is the anecdote I always like to use, where this older gentleman turns up, he's got spectacles, he's got white hair, um, he's got a walking stick, he's got a bit of a hunch, and comes into the audiologist appointment and subsequently told that he would benefit from a hearing aid. But he refuses because he doesn't want to look old, you know? And and that is often a rationale that's used. And it's like, okay, that's an interesting perspective given everything else that we can see. But that's how strong this stigma is. It is often attached with a lot of these sort of ageist, ableist sort of perspectives. Um, so really for us, actually, one of the most interesting things is, well, on one hand, I've already found that music training seems to benefit children, who are deaf and hard of hearing. Now we want to know, can it apply to an older population? And we are trying to target now specifically the group that is, I suppose, the largest cohort of people who are deaf and hard of hearing are those who actually just don't do anything about their hearing loss. So that's our sort of current research uh, direction.
Very, very interesting. For me, it's really fascinating how a community of musicians or singers or the community leads to something different. If you take the person by him or herself, and you talk about the benefits of having a hearing aid, or maybe how it will impact the musicianship, or how it will impact the way they will feel in the society and hear better. It's like, yeah, but I will feel old if I wear it.
Yeah.
And then if you bring all these people together in a choir and would you do an experiment and they all wear hearing aids and it doesn't matter anymore
Yeah, yeah,
because
yeah.
they see that, okay, if this guy is doing it, maybe he looks older than me. I'm gonna do it too.
Yes, yes, yes. That actually, like, I think so. So the examination of stigma is another sort of facet of the research that I do. And one of the things that I set up in Australia was a science workshop specifically for deaf and hard of hearing children. And it was exactly this problem where because these children are mainstream educated, they are often the only deaf and hard of hearing child, like maybe in their class, maybe in their whole cohort, maybe in the whole school. And when they come to these workshops, which are designed specifically for deaf and hard of hearing kids, a lot of the children have often come up to me and they've just looked at me. It's like, "Oh, this is just so cool. Like I've just actually never met another deaf kid." And they often write that they write to us and they'll be like, "Oh, it's so cool that like everyone here just gets it about deafness. So I don't have to just constantly explain to my teacher, like, okay, this is like these are my hearing aids and I'm going to connect my radio frequency device. I'm gonna put something on a little lanyard on you so that I can hear you. Please make sure that you switch it off when you go to the washroom." You know, all of these little things that you can easily, slip your mind. But we provide we have assistive listening devices, we have deaf awareness training for all of our educators. Everything is captioned, everything is provided also in We have written handouts for all of the experiments. And then we also remove any sort of any science experiment that's going to be maybe very loud or very reliant on hearing, for example. So there are lots of ways in which we can engage, as you say, with the community, and fundamentally bringing these kids together. Normalizing their deafness and for them to meet a peer support group.
When will that happen? This Sing Well 12 weeks?
So the Singwell will be kicking off in at the end of winter, so the start of spring next year. And it's a big multi-site project. So we have 7 sites around the world. We have partners in Canada, in the USA, in Germany, in the UK, and in Australia, and in the Netherlands. So we've got lots of partners, and hopefully we have our protocol paper published, and we will hopefully have the full paper published in 2 years' time, something like that. Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating, and it's a good segue to the last question, which is about people who might have motivated you, helped you, who were important in your career. In all this research you've done, you probably met a lot of different people who maybe I don't like the term inspired you, but
Yeah.
sometimes it's the case.
Yeah.
And I was thinking if you had one or two people or maybe more to
Yeah.
name, who would it be and why?
Yeah. I mean, I have to give a shout out firstly to my PhD supervisors from 5 years ago. So Catherine McMahon, a real expert in the audiology world. Valerie Louis, who is an expert also in cochlear implant listening and also in music. So she herself is a music therapist, and she's done a lot of work looking at this idea of music appreciation. And I just wanted to touch on it a little bit because we've been talking about hearing capacities and the ability to listen, but the idea of music appreciation is that it doesn't necessarily matter how accurate you are at perceiving music. You can still enjoy and appreciate music irrespective of that. And I think that's going to be very true. Like I think musicians, for example, they might listen to an orchestra and they can pick out all these maybe individual notes coming out of like a single player, right? But for other people, they're just going to listen to it maybe a little bit more holistically. And it doesn't really matter that you can tell what scale they're playing or what notes they're playing. You can still enjoy it. You can still appreciate it. And I think that's a very useful model for us to use, particularly when it comes to deaf and hard of hearing musical appreciation. A shout out also to Bill Thompson, an emeritus professor who is one of the leaders in music psychology. They were all really instrumental in helping shape who I am now. A little bit more recently, I've been inspired by also my PhD candidate, Felicity Bleckley, who's doing some really amazing work. And I think it really highlights the power of having that lived experience when it comes to leading these projects. There are certain ways of how she's tackling the project. This is very different to how I would have done it. And I think it's really important, number one, that I celebrate celebrate this perspective. And I'm so appreciative that I get to work and supervise Felicity as well. I'm really excited to see her become a doctor in the next few years, and excited to see all of these outputs and how it can have some impact in the next few years too. Um, in Toronto, I was really fortunate enough to meet Rory McLeod, who is I believe the founder maybe or the CEO of Xenia Concerts. And it was really my first experience being able to appreciate or even just experience to begin with these sort of casual, relaxed listening experiences. It was just so different to me because I've always been someone who's always gone to gigs, whether it's a big orchestra piece in a fancy opera to maybe me just playing some rock and roll music in a dingy pub. I've always appreciated all of these, but I think what's really interesting is that culturally, we do have certain expectations of what a concert and what a gig is. And culturally, these things are not they're transmitted very loosely, and we just somehow know how an opera is going to operate, for example. But I think this very formalization, this formal approach or these expectations are also just not in line with when we think about disability and neurodivergence. It's just fundamentally not very compatible. They are so structured for a normative person. And for me, like the music is just not normative to begin with. Like why are we trying to scaffold it into this theme? Um, and actually, I want to just have a brief segue into models. So I think, we're all probably very familiar with the medical model, which is very deficit heavy. And then, I think a lot more researchers are moving towards the biopsychosocial model where we have a much more holistic perspective of these things where there is nothing really inherently wrong with any individual. It's really based on what's happening in maybe the broader community and how we structure these things. Another model that one of the research groups that I've been working with sort of complements this, and we call it the possibility model, or rather we're borrowing this idea of the possibility model, and we're borrowing it from sort of feminist theory and from sort of queer gender theory as well. And I sort of just wanted to bring this in because I think it's a nice little segue, and it really comes out from strangely enough, it was just sort of like a Hollywood interview with transgender actor Laverne Cox, who is one of the stars from Orange is the New Black. And she was asked in an interview, it's like, like, sort of like, how do you feel about being this sort of transgender actor role model, now that you've sort of made it big? And this was her response here. Um, I would never be so arrogant to think that someone should model their life after me. But the idea of possibility, the idea that I get to live my dreams out in public, hopefully will show to other folks that it's possible. So I prefer the term possibility model to role model. And I've really taken this on in a lot of the research that I do now. And one of the other research projects that I'm a part of is broadly called deafnesses. So a pluralization of deafness. And here we're trying to have a more spectrum approach to deafness. And by that, like, we actually think this has significant implications when it comes to the treatment of deafness. So the standard model of care, for example, if you are identified as having a prelingual deafness from newborn hearing screening, you're then either recommended like hearing aids or cochlear implants in the first instance to your family. Our question is, why is that? Why has that become the stereotypical like role model approach? Like that is the first thing that the clinician or even the general public mind goes to. But to the detriment to things such as augmented communication or things like sign language. And we know this, we have the stats to back this up. Like sign language, Australian Sign Language, Auslan is decreasing, and cochlear implantation is increasing. So there's a clear relationship here, but we feel like it's a bit uncomfortable if that becomes your stereotypical role model approach, where it's like, okay, if you have a deafness, you become a cochlear implant user. For us, it's a little bit more sensible. Like, why don't we consider the breadth, and maybe we can have a bimodal approach where you can also have a cochlear implant, but you can also have sign language too. We don't want to really force anyone down this specific path. And so again, this idea of possibility model, I think, really has imparted itself upon me in almost every way that I think about life and think about research. So again, coming back to Xenia, I think again, it's this idea of really embracing the possibility model. When you go to a gig, um, there's not necessarily just one way in which you can appreciate it. And taking this spectral approach, we need to be not just accommodating of everyone, but really just it's that full acceptance and like full wanting to have maximum flourishing almost, right? We want to really maximize the opportunity and the engagement. And I really love that Xenia concept model where um, we are to some extent deconstructing what it means to have a concert. And I kind of love that, as someone who really enjoys the work of like John Cage, where you can really go outside the bounds of what like music should be. I'm all for that. And the very last person that I want to have a quick shout out to is Ben Brown, who is a deaf percussionist, and I was fortunate to meet him in Ottawa maybe two years ago, and he was running a workshop, almost this philosophical way of listening, and I just really appreciated his approach. You can imagine like I've been engaged in listening, and I'm a musician, someone who studies music psychology, someone who is really fundamentally engaged with this. And yet, some of the things he was talking about was really new and really quite mind-blowing, mind-expanding. And I appreciated how he was able to introduce me, I suppose, to new ways of listening. And that to me, again, is really falling within everything that I've said so far, this idea of this possibility model, these new ways of interpreting sound, pairing that with vision, pairing that with tactile touch. And I think, again, coming back to this idea of music as multisensory, hopefully I've done a sufficient job in tying it all together right at the end.
Well, thank you so much. And good luck with everything that is happening right now in present and future. You
Yeah.
have lots of work that is coming on that. Lots of writing too, because all that is going
Yes.
to become great articles, for
Yes.
sure. And yeah, thank you so much. And I'm sure we're gonna cross path again in some projects. So
Yes.
yeah,
I will have to find a way so that you can come visit me in Australia. There's lots of projects I want to do and lots of people I want to partner with. So we'll try and make some things happen.
thank you so much, and have a fantastic day and talk soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Dan.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.